Meanwhile, I don't know if you're aware of this, but my son Cosmo was doing anthropology at Sussex.
Right.
He's just graduated.
Okay.
And they had a module on ethnographic films.
Okay.
And you were one of the specimens.
Is
They,
that right? Oh, yeah, don't
they
tell
had
me
to
what
write
they-
essays
Is that
analysing
Yeah.
you in tribe,
Okay.
compared with other ethnographic
Sure.
films and stuff.
Well, of course, we would never call ours an ethnographic film. It's an entertainment.
Yes, well,
television
that's it. But
programme.
the point is that it was contrasting ones that did call themselves ethnographic
Yes.
films, and it was looking at a range of approaches to.
Sure.
There was some classic one done in Canada about the Inuit in the 1920s
Oh yes,
or
No
30s.
Nuke of the North, which
Yes,
is very famous, which
that's
is all
right.
completely set up, not ethnographic either.
I know that was part of what they were doing. That here's something that looks like an early ethnographic, but actually it was all
Yeah.
set up.
In fact, many of them were. Well, they used film back then, so it's much harder. You can't get very natural actions. Most things had to be set up. It's so precious.
Yes.
You're taking these canisters all the way to the north. You have to have things staged, and
Yes,
at the same time, it was still a beautiful film that really made a positive impact. But
That's
it
right.
was contrived.
Anyway, that was one. These were all the kinds of things they were discussing. Anyway, you. I don't know if you're aware of this, but undergraduates are sort of writing
Yeah,
all about
I hear it a few times.
Yes.
Actually, I hear it a few times because we made a stir when the film came out, and
Yeah.
then the anthropological community wanted to hate it, and then found that they couldn't hate it as much as they wanted to, and they were grappling with it for ages, and I think that we were very lucky. I worked with an amazing team, and we were very careful about how we went about doing things. But of course, any time you point a camera at something, by default, you're choosing where to put the camera. You're already manipulating
Yes.
the story.
Yes.
And so there is no such thing as a pure ethnographic film.
No, I think that's one of the lessons that they're learning.
Yes. Yeah.
That there is no such
No.
thing.
And it's a
And
sliding
there's
scale.
various
and we're
degrees.
Here.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's various degrees of contrivance
Absolutely.
and so on.
Yeah, and if you looked at my month with the Penang people and then the hour-long film that I get, of course you're going to have a much higher percentage of high-octane moments in
Yes.
that hour than you would have in my month. My month is actually often very gentle and quite
But that's true of
mundane.
any film or drama, isn't
Of course.
it? I mean, if you go to see the theatre to see a play, you don't see
Yeah.
sort of hours of people just sitting around having breakfast or reading the paper.
But a pure ethnographer would try, if you look some of those films that people have really tried to get that sensation where they do allow the boredom, allow the slowness to come about,
Yes.
and then maybe you're able to have a slightly more visceral experience.
Yeah.
And I think in this film we're going to dabble with that a little bit. We're starting out at the beginning very much in the head, asking questions, sort of analysing concepts, and then later on perhaps we're going to enter into a place where we can have an experience, and that will need
Yeah.
slowing down and more visual and more
Yeah.
sort of sensual photography, I guess.
Mm.
But it's a hard thing to do,
Mm.
and you know this yourself from
Yes.
your own work.
Yes, although I don't attempt to do film much. Mm.
Could you tell us a little bit about, especially your time in India,
Mm.
in Hyderabad, when you were working as a plant physiologist and came up with that very structured scientific discovery?
Mm.
How was that time for you?
Well, when I was working in Cambridge on plant development, I came to the conclusion that we simply can't understand the form of plants, how they grow, just on the basis of chemicals and DNA and genes, that something more was needed. And I took up a concept that was already established in biology, morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields. This made a lot of sense, but then the question is how are they inherited? And I came up with this unconventional, controversial theory of inheritance by morphic resonance, a kind of collective memory on which each member of a species draws and to which it contributes. I came up with that idea in Cambridge. It didn't really fit with the kind of standard mechanistic thinking of my colleagues and the atmosphere there. And I realized this was a radical break with what I'd done before, so I wanted time to think about it. And I also wanted to do something useful, and I also loved India because I'd traveled there before. So I took a job at an international agricultural institute in Hyderabad, India, where I was doing practical work on improvement of pigeon peas and chickpeas, which are big crops there. So I was living in India. I was doing practical work in the field, working in villages some of the time, outdoor experiments, and thinking about morphic resonance. I mean, that's what I did in my spare time. So I had a very interesting experience in doing all those things, because the idea of causation across time, a kind of memory to which we tune in, is unfamiliar in the West, except perhaps through Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. But in India, it's completely standard. And so what was shockingly, outrageously radical in Cambridge, when I discussed it with my Indian colleagues, including scientific colleagues, didn't seem to them radical at all. They said things like, we've known that all along. You know, what's so big and what's so new in this idea? You know, this is nothing but karma, the idea of the influence across lives and across generations and so on. The difficulty I had in India was getting them to see that this is something that could be treated scientifically and where you could do experiments, because they thought of it as a philosophical belief system.
Okay, wow. That's a really beautiful insight into those very, very particular differences. Could I take you back, though, one step? Because you said that you came up with this radical idea while you were in Cambridge. What were your influences? Did this just come to you one day, or was your previous trips to India an influence? How did it come about?
Well, I think for me, I was thinking a lot about how plants grow, how form develops, why leaves are leaves and not petals, and why oak trees look different from pines, and so on. And genes alone don't explain it. They just give you the right chemicals, the right enzymes, the right proteins. They don't explain shape. So I was wrestling with this idea of morphogenetic fields, and wrestling with the idea of how they can be inherited, and they're not inherited through the genes, so there must be some other way. And what for me was a huge breakthrough was reading a book called Matter and Memory by a French philosopher called Henri Bergson. The book was written in the late 19th century, first translated into English in 1911. And Bergson argues that memory is not stored in the brain. The brain's a receiver of memory, but not a store of memory. And that there's another kind of causation in nature, a causation across time, involved with memory. He was originally just thinking about human memory, not nature in general. But I realized that this idea of a memory principle that could exist different from our normal forms of causation could be the key to understanding a great many things in biology. And that set me off thinking. I had 4 or 5 days of kind of almost manic excitement as this idea worked through my mind, and I began to see the implications and stuff. So that was really, there was a period of sort of almost altered state of consciousness as I thought of a completely new way of seeing a lot of biological phenomena and psychological phenomena.
And do you know much about the gentleman who wrote the book and how that was received when he did? I mean, has this always been very much outside of the scientific realm, or was there a more sympathetic time in our history?
Well, in the late 19th century, there was, I think, a greater openness to holistic thinking. There was a big controversy. Within biology, there was a controversy between vitalism and mechanism. The vitalists were saying there's something more about living organisms that's not just molecular machinery. And there were philosophers who were thinking in a more holistic way. Bergson was one of them. And there were psychologists who were trying to give a broad view of the human mind. One of them was William James in the United States. He was much influenced by Bergson. I would say that there was also a big interest among intellectuals and scientists in psychical research, telepathy, survival of bodily death. These were more mainstream then than they were later. The First World War really was a kind of cut-off for that line of speculation. In the 1920s and 30s, scientific thinking became much more rigidly mechanistic. The debate was much narrower. And the more dogmatic kind of materialistic thinking we're used to became entrenched as an orthodoxy.
Why do you think it was during the First World War? Was there a reason that you can put your finger on?
It's hard to know. I mean, the First World War was a kind of watershed. It was the end of a whole phase of civilization and in the West. And it led to, I think, a great restriction of what people were prepared to think about. I don't know why. I think it stopped a lot of this spiritual exploration. In the late 19th century, a lot of English intellectuals and American intellectuals got interested in theosophy, for example, which was exploring meditation, esoteric Buddhism, Hindu philosophy. These were widely discussed. But the First World War, I suppose partly because it just killed off so many young people and was such a horrible reality check. After that, you either got the kind of hedonism of the 1920s, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Civil War, then hyperinflation and the rise of Nazism in Germany. And so the issues became much more political, much less speculative, and materialism became the kind of standard default position of intellectuals, a kind of atheistic materialism. And there was a kind of turning away from spirituality. Now, I'm not a historian, so I don't know all the reasons for that, but it had a big influence on our own culture.
You said people had a shift, but do you think to some degree that actually the general populace hasn't shifted as much as perhaps some of the academic and the intellectual scientists who have become much more narrow-minded? When I think of the mechanistic view that Descartes came about with, for example, when he was dissecting animals and saying, "Don't worry, it's just the squeakings of a machine when they were crying with pain," to the average person in the street, that seems ridiculous, and there is a holistic perspective as well as a reductionist perspective. But the scientific community seems to have just narrowed in. Would you say that they're representative of all of us in the West, or just a small group?
Well, I think they're representative of the mainstream of education, culture, government and business, because the scientific mechanistic way of thinking has become the default position of educated people, not just in the West, but in the East too. I mean, in China and India, educated Chinese and Indians are interested in the same kind of mechanistic way of thinking as the way their business and government and scientific enterprises run. And I think what's happened is that there's been a split. It goes back much further in the West, but we've created in other cultures too, between mechanistic thinking, which operates from 9 to 5 on Mondays to Fridays for most people, and then a different, more private way of experiencing nature. That's why the great cities of the Western world are clogged with traffic on Friday afternoons, as millions of people try to get back to nature in a car. There's this sense that our true selves are much more connected with nature, which is why lots of people want country cottages if they get rich, and like the idea that there's a part of themselves which is connected with nature. And that goes back much further in the West. I mean, at the end of the 18th century, when mechanistic thinking, Enlightenment rationalism, was becoming the standard intellectual mindset of educated people, science and reason, in this rather mechanistic way. There was, after all, the great Romantic movement. The Romantic poets led a kind of back to nature movement. And I think what we've had since then is a kind of cultural split where during working hours we're prepared to go along with mechanistic thinking. In our free time we think differently. And most people in our culture have that split too. Most people, if they keep a dog or a cat, know that it's not a machine. They know it's a being with feelings and thoughts and emotions and bonds with them, often telepathic. Lots of people know that, but they won't mention it at work. And lots of people who keep dogs and cats, who know that these animals have thoughts and feelings, are perfectly happy shopping in supermarkets, buying battery chicken meat that's been grown in battery chicken farms, which are based on the mechanistic principle that animals are nothing but machines. They're part of a production line for industrial farming, for factory farming. So people would be perfectly happy doing that, and as soon as they get home think quite differently about their dog or cat. So it's a completely split mentality. If you take seriously that your knowledge that dogs and cats and other animals are true living beings with feelings, and you take seriously your liking for plants, and because gardening is one of the most popular of all hobbies, and even people who don't garden have house plants. So these are enormously big parts of people's lives, plants and animals. But if you take those seriously, then you would challenge factory farming and industrial agriculture. You might become a vegetarian or an animal rights activist. So by keeping this split in our culture, it's business as usual in the government, academic, environment world, the business world. And people's feelings and the more spiritual side of their being is privatized into their private lives and kept strictly separate from the public domain. We've now created the split in other cultures. We've exported Western scientific materialism, so it's the dominant ethos of the ruling classes in Africa, Asia, South America, everywhere. But when they're off duty, in India, most Indians go back to being traditional Hindus or Muslims or Jains or whatever they are. And when Japanese are off duty, a lot of them appreciate haikus and cherry blossom and so forth. So I think this split, we've got so used to it, it's hard to see that we live this very split life.
I totally agree. It's beautiful the way you describe it. I think that I am very much a victim of that myself. I was not an intellectual at school. I wanted to side with the people who were the rationalists, the people who were doing well at school. I wanted to be in that group. And so when it has come about in my recent history that I've had these extraordinary experiences that have challenged my rational perspective of life, I find it very, very hard to let go. I find it very hard to explore them even. I've wanted to put them in a box and categorize it, put a label on it and say, oh, that was just me doing ayahuasca. It's a drug. It means nothing.
Yes.
And yet there have been experiences that have really taken me into a magical realm. And it's been beautiful. And yet maybe I haven't yet fully had the courage to let go of some of those mechanistic views because I don't want to be seen as stupid, because I'm still perhaps a little bit insecure in my intellect. And do you think that that's quite common in our world, that people like myself are struggling with this bipolar perspective?
Oh, yes. I think it's very common. I mean, we all experience it. I mean, I had the same experiences too, that everybody in our culture, I think, is torn between this kind of rationalist, scientific, materialist worldview and the more private feelings we have, our more private experiences. And I think it's the basis of our whole civilization as it's now constituted. So I don't think it's unique to you at all.
No. What do you think the dangers are? Do we need to recap? We remember what we were talking about. I was just...
the split.
What are the dangers, you think, in our society of this split?
I think it's very unhealthy to have this split between rational intellect and science and feelings, emotion and experience, which everybody has to some degree. And it comes from a particular scientific view. It's not as if science has to be split off from experience like that. But we have a kind of science at the moment based on a materialist philosophy that says the only reality is matter. The mind is nothing but the activity of the brain. It's all inside the head. And basically consciousness doesn't really exist. It's a kind of illusion produced by the computing machinery of the brain. So this enormously downgrades consciousness, treats it as an illusion, as something that's just subjective, unscientific and therefore irrational. And completely dismisses all the things that are most important to us. I mean, value, meaning, beauty, purpose, love. I mean, those are nothing but chemical balances or electrical patterns in the brain, or sort of impulses crossing synapses, or waves of electrical activity in the cerebral cortex or the lower brain. These are tremendously demystifying ways of looking at the world. And even the most hard headed materialist doesn't really believe that. I mean, they don't really believe like that when they get home from the lab. I mean, if they did, they'd have very dysfunctional relationships with their partners, their children, and their animals. So they revert to being ordinary people once they get home, or at least the majority do. So I think it's a terribly unhealthy philosophy. And I don't think it's necessary for science either. I think it's in fact become a straitjacket, a constriction on science itself. The whole point of my recent book, The Science Delusion, is that science has become imprisoned within a materialistic dogmatism that's restricting what science itself can do, restricting the freedom of inquiry, and producing a highly distorted view of the world. It's very good for building machines. If you take the assumption that everything's mechanistic, it gives you a wonderful philosophy for machinery and for the Industrial Revolution and from computers and smartphones and internet and jet planes, all tremendously impressive. But it gives you a very bad way of understanding the natural world, the nature of life, the nature of mind, of consciousness, of human society, of culture, of myth, of story, of religion, of spiritual experience. Those are simply airbrushed out of the picture by this worldview, reduced to mere activity of material brains. So I think it's a very unhealthy philosophy, not just for society, not just for individuals, but for science itself.
And why is it come about like that? Is it just because if it can't be measured, it can't be true? Is that what science has become?
I think it's more than just that. It's partly if it can't be measured, it can't be true. But it's basically an ideology that's developed. The history, very briefly, is that in the 17th century there was a split, the Descartes split, the Cartesian split between mind and matter. Descartes defined matter as unconscious and minds as conscious but non-material. So the only non-material things in the universe were God, angels, and human minds. The whole of the rest of the universe was unconscious matter. The human body was unconscious matter, a machine. The human mind, unlike animal minds, or animals didn't have minds, unlike anything else in nature, was immaterial and spiritual. This gave a split between science and religion, and it enabled science to get on with studying the universe, and religion to remain in a separate compartment. Descartes himself was quite religious. All the founding fathers of modern science were. But it created this completely disconnected mind. And it worked reasonably well till the 19th century, and a lot of people then got very upset about there being two things. They said, we just want one thing, not two things, not dualism. And so some became idealists and said the only reality is mind or consciousness. Matter is kind of dumbed-down mind that's trapped in patterns of habit. The other lot, the materialists, said this so-called immaterial mind doesn't exist. Angels and God, forget it, they're just illusions, they don't exist at all. And the human mind isn't something special, it's just the activity of the brain, it's nothing but the brain. So materialism was a denial of the spiritual or mental pole of dualism. And dualism itself was, I think, a very foreshortened, false kind of philosophy of nature, oversimplified philosophy of nature. But it served the purposes of science in the 17th and 18th century, and it kept science and religion out of each other's hair most of the time and enabled people to go on being religious and go on being scientific. It provided a way of them living together fairly harmoniously. So it served a useful purpose. But in the end, it's very unsatisfactory. So I think I'm not in favour of materialism or idealism or dualism. I think that the basic model of reality we need is Trinitarian. We need at least three basic principles, not two or one. But that's just another discussion. I mean, it's a whole metaphysical question. Sure. But the reason materialism came in was through denying dualism. And it arose for ideological reasons, and it was then backed with the authority of the Enlightenment project of science and reason. And science is so successful in giving technologies, most people think it must be true. What could possibly be wrong with this theory of nature? It works. But it's created all these terrible problems we now face today. the way forward, I think, is by realizing that materialism is an ideology that science is actually already outgrowing, actually in many ways has outgrown.
Through things like?
Well, through a more holistic view of nature, through, for example, Gaia theory, the idea that the Earth's a living organism. It's a perfectly credible scientific theory, and it's much better than thinking of the Earth as just an assemblage of inanimate material. It has a unity, a holistic unity. Big Bang theory of the universe says the whole universe starts small, very small. It's like the cracking of a cosmic egg, that it hatches, as it were, the universe, and then it grows and expands and new things appear within it. This is like a growing embryo or tree. It's much more like a growing organism than like a clockwork machine, which was the old view of the universe, a kind of machine universe. The universe is now like a holistic, unified, growing organism where everything is interrelated. The universal gravitational field contains everything that is, according to Einstein's theory. Everything is within this field which unifies and unites and connects everything. So I think we're actually getting, in many ways, towards a more holistic view of nature through science itself.
And do you think that the ancient Eastern traditions and maybe even indigenous traditions are finally being understood in a way in the West that is part of this new opening?
I don't think that's happened yet. I mean, I think it ought to happen and should happen, but and maybe you're somebody who's helping to make it happen. I mean, this is the idea that we could learn something from indigenous, especially animistic traditions, is not something that most Western intellectuals have considered. The whole Enlightenment project was to leave behind religion and superstition and march ahead into science and reason. And from the Enlightenment point of view, primitive tribes were just that, primitive people who had a childlike level of understanding, who needed to be improved and developed by us, which is why the missionaries of science and technology have spread out throughout the world and converted the entire world now, and all its governments at least, to the idea of economic development through science and technology. Because they're backward, primitive, superstitious, they need to be educated, they need to become literate, they need to have modern technologies, they need to go to school, and they need to learn about modern science, because that's the only way they can become modern, educated, liberated people. So why bother studying their traditions? It's just mumbo-jumbo. They need educating out of them. So I think that's been the predominant attitude of the ruling classes here, and of intellectuals. And I think anthropologists haven't served us very well, because they're the people who've actually spent lots of time with traditional people, field work, often living there for a year or two or more. But they go with the mindset that what these people believe is mumbo-jumbo, and they want to classify it. They want to understand this kinship structure, the power structure, describe the myths of these people, all very valuable. But as regards taking seriously that their shamans really heal, or that they really fly in their visions, or that they really contact animal spirits, or that rainmakers can really make rain, that's something that would not be permissible for the average anthropologist. I think they have these experiences when they're there. Many of them have experiences they can't share and can't talk to their colleagues about when they get back to their university. They're sort of filtered out of this kind of rationalistic view of these other cultures. And of course, if anthropologists start taking psychoactive drugs with these tribal people, or start dancing and getting into trances, or taking part in shamanic ceremonies, then they're breaking a terrible taboo. It's a slippery slope that could lead to them going native. And that, of course, is the last thing that they're meant to do.
But it's okay on television.
It's okay on television because it's classified as entertainment.
Yeah. It's wonderful hearing all the way you describe that, because that resonates very deeply with myself. I have had these experiences, and I used to come back and classify them and talk to my very clever friends who I looked up to, and they say, "Oh, Bruce, you were just doing a drug. It means nothing at all." Or, "Oh, Bruce, you were just doing a dance, and so therefore it means nothing." And yet it now seems that there are voices in the intellectual world, in the scientific world, who are beginning to give credence to some of these perspectives.
Yes.
You being very much one of them. But how far away are we from this shift happening in the scientific world? Do you see it on the horizon, or are you still seen as a crackpot very much on the outside?
Well, it depends whether you talk to people in public or in private. In public, most people in the academic world, indeed most educated people, who've all got materialism as the kind of default worldview that's sort of factory installed at university in most people's minds, or even at school, or by the time you get to the sixth form in an English school, the last 2 years of school, you're pretty well filled up with this worldview. That's the official worldview, and any educated person knows that's what they're meant to believe. So in public, they usually pretend to believe it in order to retain their credibility as an educated person. Because if you don't believe this, then you're either stupid or feeble-minded, or you've been duped, or you're gullible, or you've been victim of some guru or cult or something, or your mind's been addled by excessive drug taking or something of that kind. So people don't want to lose their credibility. For example, telepathy, a subject on which I do research, is something that most educated people experience. Most people experience it in connection with telephone calls, for example. They think of someone who then rings, and then they say, "It's funny, I was just thinking of you." I've done lots of experiments. It seems to be real, telephone telepathy, and there really does seem to be a telepathic influence here. Now, 80% of the population have experienced that, including educated people. But most of them wouldn't want to admit it in public to other educated people because it would lower their social standing. Whereas in private, if they're friends or members of your family who've had a few glasses of wine or something, most people are perfectly prepared to talk about this. In the scientific world, I would say most scientists have had psychic experiences or been to alternative healers or have dogs that know when they're coming home in a way that's seemingly telepathic, or have had altered states of consciousness, or have religious or spiritual practices, or have taken psychedelic drugs and have seen a different aspect of consciousness. Probably if you add up all these things, it's the majority. Very few of them are card-carrying Dawkinsites. But when they're in public, and especially when they're at work, they wouldn't want to mention these things to their colleagues. So they're very much in the closet about these kinds of experiences. I find many scientists read my books, for example, and are quite sympathetic and very friendly. And I get hundreds of friendly emails, and lots of people in scientific conferences and scientific institutes tell me they're very interested in these things, have these experiences themselves. But they almost always say, "I can't tell my colleagues because they're so straight." So there's a kind of conspiracy of silence about these things, a kind of taboo, which we'd be so much better off without. I mean, I hope that your explorations and your journey is part of a process of opening up this whole field of debate, because most people in private will be prepared to admit these things are very interesting, and people see films and television in the private part of their lives usually, so they're more open to it. When they're at work, they may not want to talk about it or admit they've been following your explorations or journey.
That's very sweet of you. Rupert, you said that you've been experimenting in some of these areas, and obviously you're a scientist. You understand the scientific methodology. You know about double blind, about repeatable experiments, and all the rest of it. How you mentioned telepathy. How do you think that you have proven telepathy from a scientific perspective? Have you gone that far, or is it something that's ethereal and it can't ever really be shown through that methodology?
Oh yes, it can be investigated scientifically, and I think the evidence is already very strong. And if you look with scientific experiments, you do statistical analyses, and the statistical evidence for telepathy is much greater than the evidence for the Higgs boson, which is, after all, a pretty ethereal object. You don't ever see a Higgs boson. All you do is see sort of outputs from particle tracks of elusive particles in records from atom smashers, like the Large Hadron Collider. You don't actually see one, you don't actually get one and hold it in your hand. And yet these things are taken enormously seriously in science. And so is dark matter and dark energy. They make up 96% of reality, and no one has a clue what they are. And most scientists take them seriously. And many scientists take seriously the idea of hundreds of millions of parallel universes that no one's ever observed and for which there's not a shred of evidence. So it's not as if scientists demand things you can hold in a kind of common sense way. Nowadays, modern physics has dissolved reality into virtual realities and invisible dimensions and parallel universes and quantum processes that no one really understands and elusive particles that exist only as momentary traces or whispers of their presence that are known only in terms of statistical probabilities. Science has moved on a long way from kind of 19th century steam engine-based science. Modern physics is almost entirely about esoteric phenomena that hardly anyone can understand, with extra dimensions and so on. Telepathy is much, much more real than that. I mean, it's much more easy to test. And in our telephone telepathy tests, for example, we have tests in which the subject names 4 people they might be telepathic with, close friends or family members. They sit at home with a landline telephone, no caller ID display. We film them to make sure they're not getting other phone calls or emails. We pick one of the 4 callers at random, ring them up and ask them to call the subject. They do. The phone rings. They know it's one of these 4 people. They have to guess which of those people before they answer it. I think it's John. They pick it up. Hello, John. You're right or you're wrong. By chance, you'd be right one time in 4, 25%. In these tests, they were right about 45% of the time. And it's hugely significant statistically. This has been replicated in universities in Europe. I now have an automated version of the test working on mobile phones that anyone can try for themselves. I think the evidence is pretty strong. 80% of people have had this experience. It's very familiar to lots of people. The only experiments that have been done to test it have shown that this seems to be a statistical reality. It's more significant than the Higgs boson. Anyone can do the tests for themselves. These large-scale tests are giving positive results. I think this is fairly good evidence. The skeptics who are opposed to this don't have any evidence at all. All they have is their prejudices. And they're basically hardcore materialists who are ideologically committed to a worldview which I think is completely incoherent. The reason they exist is because, for historical reasons, we had this reaction against religion in the West, the growth of atheism and materialism, the capture of science by materialist ideology, and now a kind of entrenched defense of a materialist worldview by people who are terrified that if you let go of this, the world will be swamped by superstition and occultism and black magic, and what Freud called the black mud of superstition will overwhelm civilization. It has to be defended at all costs. So it's a kind of hysterical denial of phenomena which, in fact, can be investigated scientifically, and if they exist, don't destroy science, they enlarge science. It's much worse for science to be in a position of denialism, pretending things don't exist that do exist, rather than expanding and having a larger, more comprehensive and more rational scientific view of reality.
Do you see that crumbling happening in our lifetime?
I think that this materialist worldview is crumbling all around us as we speak. First of all, physics itself has gone beyond it. Quantum physics has long since gone beyond old-style mechanistic thinking. Current biologists, many of them, are trying to reduce the phenomena of life to the physics of the 19th century, but physics has moved on. And So I think that within science itself, we've moved beyond that. The Big Bang Theory, the idea of an evolutionary universe, tells us we live in an organic, growing universe which is creative. The entire evolutionary process is creative. Long before evolution begins on Earth, we've had billions of years of cosmic evolution, stars, galaxies, planets.
Rupert, you mentioned the word fear. I think you're right. That's the sense I get. It's an incredible holding on for a paradigm that seems to be shaking. And you say that that could fit hand in glove with the new perspective, and it shouldn't be a problem. And don't worry, we're not going to wallow in a world of superstition. But in a way, if the mechanistic paradigm does crumble, it does open all sorts of uncertainties that are completely beyond the realm of measurement, beyond the realm of anything. And so I can understand a fear. The whole thing is up for grabs in a way if we let go of that. Do you think that their fear is valid, or do you think it would be a positive period that we would go into, or would it be a crazy time?
I think we're going into a crazy time anyway. Mm. We're going into a crazy time because of environmental crisis, extreme weather events, meltdown of the financial system, the collapse of the established neoliberal dogmas, global trade, corporate capitalism, banks, investment, governments just sort of delivering endless economic growth through. None of that's going to be happening in the business as usual model. So we're into very uncharted waters, whether or not there's a change in science. I think that everybody knows that it's not going to be business as usual anymore. So I think our best bet is actually to look as rationally and reasonably as we can at what science can tell us. An expanded kind of science would be more open, less exclusive, less dogmatic, and I think is still our best guide, but not in a form of dogmatic materialism. I think science and reason are enormously valuable. That's why I'm a scientist, and I try to pursue science in a reasonable way. But what's often called science and reason today is neither scientific nor rational. It's an ideological belief system. And after all, the modern world isn't exactly governed by science and reason. I mean, the reasons for the fact that Britain and many other countries are still building and maintaining nuclear weapons is based on fear, which is not rational or scientific in the sense it's, these are emotions. The advertising industry is based on encouraging the 7 deadly sins, lust, avarice, envy, sloth, greed. These are we've got an entire sophisticated, scientifically based in psychology industry persuading people to adopt what in the past were universally regarded as vices, because those are engines of economic growth. And economic growth is destroying the planet in many ways and changing the climate. Is that rational? Well, it isn't. And attempts to look at climate change and environmental destruction scientifically and rationally, and then discuss it rationally by governments meeting in United Nations conferences, doesn't result in a rational, politically agreed solution. It results in no action at all. It results, or very little, it results in setting up more committees and agreeing to have further discussions. Meanwhile, governments are captives of a political and economic system over which they're not really in control either.
Do you think that if we do move into a new paradigm and people see that there's much more connection than we previously perhaps felt or were aware of, and that there are things greater than us, greater than the whole, and that there's much more meaning in the universe than we generally take within our culture, that this will have an impact in our behaviour, in our ethics, in our morals? Do you see us changing as a society as a result of these new perspectives if we are able to bring them on board?
I'd like to think so, but I think we've got so used to splitting ourselves that I'm not sure how much that would happen. I mean, there's a part of most modern people, which the romantic part, where they do feel a connection with the natural world, and at least with their garden and plants and their pet animals and their friends and so on, and where they're not operating in this kind of materialistic way. But we're still used to the whole public domain being given over to that economic corporate activity, profit-making and all the rest of it, which has to be changed too. We have to find new ways of creating jobs, employment, running government, industry and so forth, that are less destructive of the environment. Personal changes are relatively easy, and lots of people undergo personal changes, and they meditate or they have explorations of inner experience and that sort of thing, or they have psychotherapy, or they have religious and spiritual practices. But the public domain remains fairly unchanged. So I think the challenge is finding a new politics and a new way of ordering society. And I think that as far as people's changes are concerned, it often involves changing communities, not just individuals. And that's where I think religion has a major role to play, because one of the reasons why we have this fragmented society in the West is because of a decline of organized religion. It's now, in Western Europe, a very marginal part of most of social life. It used to be very important, and it's now very unimportant for most people. In Britain, way less than 10% of people have regular religious observance or practice. 90% of people don't, and some of them are spiritual but not religious, others are atheist or agnostic, but alienated at any rate from traditional religious practice. And it may be that that's a liberating thing, it may be that it helps in some way getting out of the bad aspects of traditional religion, but it's also isolating, and I think that if there's going to be any kind of integrative growth of a new society, there has to be some kind of spiritual or religious dimension to it, and science can't provide that.
No, I totally agree. Do you think that that many people, if they do move away from religion because of the reasons that you highlighted, perhaps there's been some dogma or some aspects to the human aspects of that religious belief that they kind of don't feel they're in alignment with anymore, but they still carry on with a spiritual practice in some way. They feel that they are part of something that's bigger than them. Do you think that there's a void there, that some new spiritual understanding could come about, that that people might have a sympathy for, that isn't so dogmatic and historical as, or do you think that that actually our traditional beliefs are something that we should go back to?
Well, I think that we have to. I think a spiritual journey that's purely individual is the easiest thing to do, and in the modern world it's very attractive to a lot of people because it doesn't involve having to deal with the historical baggage of organized religions, Eastern or Western. And I think it's helpful, but I think the problem with it is that religion is typically something done by communities, not just individuals. And I lived in India for 7 years, and one of the things I loved about Indian culture was that when there are festivals, like these great Hindu festivals like Diwali, or, then there are things that everyone takes part in. The kids are there, the grown-ups are there, the old people are there. The whole community takes part in a festival. Now, we still have a residue of that in England with Christmas, where Christmas is a traditional festival which does involve most people. And even if for many people the religious focus is not the central one, many of the themes of it being a collectively enjoyed festival are there. I think we need festivals. I think we need sacred places. I think we need pilgrimages and things like that, which are all part of traditional religious practice. Hindus have pilgrimages, Muslims have them. After all, the Hajj to Mecca is the biggest in the world of pilgrimages. And In England, in the Middle Ages, there were lots of pilgrimages. Canterbury was one of the great centres, and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was, after all, set on a pilgrim journey. There are still pilgrimage places in England, and there are plenty in continental Europe, and there are some wonderful ones in Ireland. So I think that these are things, recovering a sense of sacred place, sacred festivals, collective celebration, are more to do with religion than an entirely individualized pick and mix spirituality, which, if people have a bit of Native American here mixed in with a bit of Buddhism and, a few crystals and that kind of thing, I mean, you can make your own kind of salad, a spiritual salad, and it fits with this very Western obsession with free choice and individualism. But it doesn't have this collective dimension, which I think we need as well, because we're social animals and we need to express our spiritual lives, not just individually, but in community, and we need to have something in which children can grow up and feel part of a larger community. So I do think in all cultures, the traditions are very important. And one of the things that makes other cultures attractive to us is the fact that they do have collective celebrations and shared experiences and traditions that they follow. If one went, probably in a few years' time, when you visit tribal cultures, they'll have lost them, and they'll all be playing video games on handheld devices and linked up to the internet through smartphones and so on, and part of the same world we're in here. Is that an advance? Some might think so, but it will make them much less interesting to us, because the very thing we appreciate in them are the things that we've lost ourselves. And if they lose them too, then I think we'll be much less interested in them. So I think what other cultures have to offer us, and what's so attractive about them, is this tradition, this integration of individuals with a community and with the ancestors and with tradition. And I think we need to recover that ourselves.
Would you be interested in a recovery of something like that goes all the way back, perhaps, before Christianity, before paganism back? Do you think that there's still enough that we could pull out of the ashes of some of our oldest traditions and have them as unifying ways of coming together as community?
Well, I think that the oldest traditions probably had, which in a way we still have, are seasonal festivals. I mean, if we look at the megalithic monuments of Europe, Newgrange in Ireland, which is lit up on the winter solstice, and something like West Kennet Longbarrow in Wiltshire, which is similar to Newgrange. This is 3,500 BC. This is one of the oldest buildings in Britain. Of course, humans go back hundreds of thousands of years, and people were doing paintings in caves 30,000 years ago. But thinking of Britain, which is where we are now, 3,500 BC, that's aligned on the equinox. So the light at the day when the spring and autumn equinoxes, the light shines into that chambered tomb. So it's clear that these traditional societies were ordering their society in accordance with the seasons of the year. This is pretty basic. And I think that the seasonal festivals they were Christianized. The ancient seasonal festivals in Europe were taken over and incorporated into Christian seasonal festivals. So I think the way in which most of them survive today is in their Christianized form. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's a cultural integration. And most of what we see in traditional Christianity is based on pre-Christian roots. It's integrated them. So I don't see it as we're stripping away the whole of 2,000 years of Christian tradition and somehow trying to go back to some purer, earth-based religion. I see it's better to build on. It's been an accretive growth, a growth and integration over a long period, and I think it's better to continue with an evolutionary process that integrates rather than trying to get back to some kind of megalithic fundamentalism, because we know so little about it anyway,
Yes.
that we'd be totally at the mercy of rival schools of archaeologists who all have different theories as to what these ancient monuments or cave paintings were all about.
Have you had moments in your own life that have given you strong sensations of things that are paranormal, non-scientific, connections to the universe, or whatever, all of these things that that we generally rationally dismiss? Have you had your own very strong experiences like that?
I have, yes. I mean, I've had quite a few experiences where I felt that I'm part of something much greater than myself, that my mind's part of a much greater conscious being or beings. I think these are common. I don't think I'm particularly special in that respect. I think many people have them. In our culture, there's a taboo against talking about them. As a child, I had a very strong sense of connection with the natural world and with animals. I kept a lot of pets, and I was really into plants and animals. That's why I became a biologist. I've had experiences, when I've been meditating, that a sense of being connected to something much greater than myself. Senses when I've been in the natural world, in beautiful settings with flowers, in gardens, in woods, in mountains, which again I think many people have, a sense of connection with a much greater reality than my own rather petty personal concerns. I have had various experiences of altered states of consciousness. I have experiences of beauty, transcendent beauty. I mean, for me, one of the most beautiful, almost predictably beautiful experiences in England is going to choral evensong in one of our great cathedrals, where you, almost every day, they have this choir singing sublimely beautiful music in these magnificent Gothic structures or Norman structures that have been there for hundreds of years, resonating to sacred music, and you hear this music echoing around the cathedral. A solemn, dignified liturgy with wonderful language. This is enormously, I think, beautiful for me, transcendently beautiful, and something which is produced in some of these things can't be turned on like a tap. They come spontaneously and unbidden. But it's pretty predictable that choral evensong in one of our cathedrals is going to be a beautiful and, if you're open to it, moving experience. And it's a wonderful thing that all over Britain, indeed all over the world, on a daily basis, people are carrying out these kinds of rituals and sacred chant and singing in ancient sacred places, maintaining traditions and connections with the past, which, however they work, are moving to many people. I don't think I'm unique again in these respects. So, yes, I think that almost anyone probably has experiences of a world and conscious realms greater than themselves. If they don't, I think they're probably leading a very impoverished life. But lots of people get this through direct experience, through art, through music, through dancing together, through religious ceremony and ritual, through sacred places, through mountains, through woods, through making love, through personal experiences that take us beyond our normal routines. So I think this is what makes life worth living, and it's what makes life worth living for most people, whatever their religious beliefs or scientific beliefs. But I think it's possible to lead a more integrated life where these experiences are integrated with one's intellectual understanding rather than being in completely separate compartments. And I think it's probably healthier to find a more integrated way of living, personally and collectively.
I've been very privileged to have been in positions where I've been right next to all sorts of extraordinary activities, shamans speaking in tongues and reaching altered states and all sorts of stuff. And by and large, I was actually not open to it and didn't feel much at all. I was one of those impoverished people, and I really was. I mean, I was sympathetic and I was respectful, but I was very closed. And it was only actually later that I allowed myself, through the intellect, to open, that I was able to feel all these other sensations that came flooding in with joy. What was holding me back from having those experiences first?
I think all of us are held back by some reasonable level of fear. I mean, if we're open to everything, we'd be swept along in all sorts of chaotic directions, and there are a lot of things I don't particularly want to be open to. I mean, I don't want to be open to the experience of heroin addiction, for example. I think it's reasonable to be fearful of certain destructive kinds of addiction, even though I dare say there's a pleasure to it. People do it because there's an overwhelming momentary pleasure involved. But so I don't think being open to everything is a virtue necessarily. I think that being excessively fearful on the basis of an intellectual theory is probably an inhibiting and constricting thing. And I think, dogma and prejudice shape us all, and we have to become aware of what holds us back. I find myself, one of the things I was closed about was the Christian tradition. I mean, I became a scientific atheist when I was at school and at university, because that was part of the package deal. If you become a scientist, you become a materialist, you become an atheist, you sneer at every kind of religious tradition on the grounds you're smarter than them. Here are all these stupid people believing all these dogmas, and I've risen above it. I mean, the bonus for atheists is feeling that you're smart. I thought that was great, for a while. And then I realised actually this was rather a shallow position, and it was cutting me off from things. When I travelled for the first time in Asia, in India, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Thailand. I travelled there in the 1960s and found cultures of people who seemed to me very sophisticated and smart, not stupid, not contemptibly corrupt or bogged down in superstition, but with highly sophisticated views of the world, Buddhist monks, Hindu meditators, sadhus, who seemed to have a much bigger grasp of reality than anything I'd come across. That really opened my mind up. But I still retained a prejudice against Christianity, which is the standard default Enlightenment position of educated people in the West. It wasn't till many years later, when I was living in India, that I found a way of coming to terms with the Christian tradition, which I'd got a great prejudice against. It wasn't exactly fear, it was a kind of just a deep prejudice that I'd inherited from this kind of Enlightenment rationalist propaganda, which has been a standard part of Western education for 200 years, implicitly at least. So I think it's not just fear, it's taboos and it's dogmas and it's prejudices. And we're all going to end up with taboos, dogmas and prejudices. It's probably impossible to be free of them all, but some are more harmful and restrictive than others. And so I think through travelling, through exploration, through talking to others and through experience, we can become more open. But in a way, we have to find a path that we can follow, and we can't go on endlessly being open to everything because, it's limitless. One has to find a way of living. And that's the challenge, to be open enough to find things that contribute to a way of living in a more harmonious way, but not making exploration a full-time job, because one has to get on with the rest of one's life too.
Sure. Although what you say resonates very deeply with me, I think that I still have a bit of my own shadow, is my Christian background. I was very Christian when I was younger, and I enjoyed it, and I expressed a belief. I was almost evangelical at times, and then I went into the period of my life of deep questioning, and I realised there's many things about it that didn't fit for me. And then I, having also experienced other cultures and other traditions, I saw that there was a vast array of stuff that was as wonderful, it seemed to me. And yet I still kept a little bit of a dark perspective of my own background, perhaps a bit of fear, perhaps a bit of were definitely prejudice, perhaps a bit of embarrassment of having been there once or something. And I think I've still got to deal with that. I think that's part of my own journey. Maybe my mum may come and do ayahuasca with me. She's debating it herself, and I invited her just the other day, and she's a very staunch Christian and has been her whole life, and all of my family are. So I think that will be a really interesting time for me. Do you have any advice?
Well, I think if she's going to do that, it might be easier to do it in Brazil, where they have these Christian ayahuasca-based churches, Santo Daime, for example, which is a syncretic thing where they've got the whole Christian tradition, and they take this mind-altering substance as a communion in a group. And if she did it in a shamanic context in Peru or something, then that's got a whole other cultural packaging, and it might be easier for her to make a bridge with her Christian background to take ayahuasca in a Christian setting where it's preceded by prayers. The ayahuasca people in the Santo Daime tradition start with the Our Father and the Hail Mary, and it's the hymns that they sing, and obviously not the same kinds of hymns you get in the Church of England. They're their own ayahuasca songs, but they relate to the Christian tradition in a way that might be much more helpful to your mother than something that's from some completely different and unconnected tradition. I don't like giving generic advice because it depends on where people are coming from. You know, everyone starts from a different position, and so it's very hard to give kind of all-purpose, one-size-fits-all suggestions. But I think in terms of science, I think it's important to be aware of the restrictions and dogmas of materialism and how to go beyond them. And that's what I try and address in my book, The Science Delusion, which is called Science Set Free in America, because it is about setting science free. When it comes to a spiritual journey, I think people have to find a path that makes sense for them. Sometimes people have a problem with a religious tradition which they've been brought up. I mean, there are lots of people who are embittered by a fundamentalist background, or people who've had a hard time with the Roman Catholic Church or something. But nowadays, at least in Europe, most people haven't had any religious instruction at all. They've grown up in a kind of religious void, and there's no reason to buy into other people's traumas with particular. They find their own. I myself think it's really important to come to terms with one's own religious tradition. I mean, if one comes from a Christian background, with the Christian tradition; if one's Jewish, with the Jewish tradition; if one's Muslim, with the Muslim tradition; Hindu, the Hindu tradition. Even if one wants to move to a different tradition or move beyond it, it's not going to go away by just ignoring it. And that's why I feel that so much, even in people who are anti-religious, I mean, atheists in Europe are a kind of extreme Protestant sect. I see them as a Christian heresy, as a Christian sect.
Atheists?
Yes, atheism is a kind of Protestant heresy. The Protestants rebelled against the Roman Church by criticizing its sort of the superstition. They were against pilgrimage because none of these sacred places in Europe are in the Bible, because the Bible's only about sacred places in Palestine. And so they were against pilgrimage, they were against the sacred festivals because they said they're pagan, which they were. They were Christianized So there was this kind of skeptical critique of many aspects of Roman Catholicism. That's what Protestantism was about. But they held on to the Bible and faith and the Word of God in the Bible. And then if you just take that one step further and turn that same critique on biblical-based Protestantism, you arrive at atheism. And,
I've never heard it described like that before. It's really...
Well, I think it's a kind of extreme form of Protestantism, and it has that same kind of evangelical flavour as a lot of Protestantism, some evangelical Protestantism. I mean, we've all come across evangelical atheists who feel it's their mission to liberate the world from religion and sort of turn everyone on to science and reason and that kind of thing. I see it essentially as a Christian heresy.
they're high priests in their own right.
Yes, they're high priests in their own right. They've created a kind of alternative religion of science, whereas they've turned science into a religious system, which is very bad for science because it shouldn't be a dogmatic fundamentalist belief system. It should be a method of open inquiry. And agnostics and secular humanists, again, I think are people who are, as it were, heretical Christians. They retain the morality of most of Christianity, helping others, caring about the poor, the sick, the downtrodden, widows and orphans. All these basic ethical teachings are there. But they just don't want what they see as the supernatural dogmatism or credulity. But essentially, they have all the hard work of Christianity without the fun. And I think that's, again, something that one needs to be aware of, these historical influences, because we're all formed by historical habits, cultural habits and personal habits. And if one's unaware of them, one's a kind of victim of them. And if one's aware of them, one can accept them more thankfully, or reject them if one wants to reject them, but reject them in a more conscious way.
I think I could learn from your words there. I think I need to take on board that myself. In my own journey, through my inner investigation, which has only happened really as a result of understanding Eastern traditions and shamanic traditions, that I have been able to look inside and found that actually it seemed that there was an ethical code that was always there. I have an understanding of how to behave in most given situations if I am only able to be present with my deeper self. And yet, at the same time, that's not often what my previous Christian beliefs were about. My ethical code there came from a book, and it came from a pulpit. And I kind of have chosen to prefer my own inner understanding because it seems to be more loving, actually, a lot of the time. It seems to be less corruptible and more respectful often. And so that's why I've kind of stepped away from that quite happily. But I also think that my stepping away has left a darkness, a shadow, and that I have to come to terms with that and see that there is immense beauty and immense wisdom and immense love in that tradition that I came from, and that I shouldn't turn my back on it. I need to incorporate it, perhaps. And yet at the same time, I don't want to lose that inner understanding, because I think that's something that feels very real to me. Would you say you have a similar?
Yes, it's very similar. I mean, I think for me, the what was important was, because I did reject the Christian tradition, and then I was in India. I was doing yoga and meditation and visiting temples and going to pilgrimage places and listening to gurus and gained and learned a huge amount from that. And I still do yoga on a daily basis and I meditate. So I didn't see it as either or. I saw it as both and. I mean, if you do yoga, and it doesn't mean to say you can't go to choral evensong in a cathedral, and nor would any Hindu expect that. I mean, most Hindus have a very inclusive view of religion. They're prepared to embrace all forms of spirituality.
Yes, they really are, yeah.
It's a very inclusive, not exclusive approach to religion, which I think we've got a lot to learn from. So I don't see it as either or, and I don't see personal spiritual experience as being somehow contrary to collective participation in collective religion, like services and festivals. I see it as completely complementary. I don't see that it's either or.
Nice.
I think it's both and.
Yeah. No, you're making me think already a great deal about my own journey, and for that, Rupert, I'm really grateful.
Well, maybe you should go to choral evensong as part of this film.
I was thinking,
somewhere like Westminster Abbey, they do it almost every day. Lincoln Cathedral.
Yes.
All our great cathedrals. During term time, the boys are on holiday, in the summer. But a choral evensong at a cathedral would be a very good way of connecting with the whole tradition, because you've got the building, hundreds of years of history, and this whole musical tradition for centuries. a whole liturgy which is dignified, and because choral evensong on weekdays doesn't have a sermon, there's not going to be anything to put most people off in terms of the preaching, although sermons are often quite helpful, but it's an experience of meditation, prayer, contemplation and tradition.
Well, I think you really have got me thinking. I think I need to take my parents. That's what I need to do. I need to reconnect with that element, because I do upset them at times. I haven't come to terms with my past in that way,
Yes.
and they represent that. And I think that talking to you now has softened me a little, and I see the wisdom of that. So I'll make a promise to you now, Rupert, that I'm going to take my parents to an evensong. I mean, both my brothers were choristers in Wells Cathedral. I went to that school, and
there you are. Go to evensong in Wells.
Yeah, with my family.
I was in Wells just a couple of days ago.
Is that right?
It's
a beautiful place,
wonderful place.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that would be a wonderful thing. Go to evensong in Wells Cathedral with the family.
Yeah.
In a spirit of just being part of it, not trying to be separate, but just, if you're asking them to share with you in ayahuasca, then share with them in what's a family tradition.
Wow, that's a really lovely idea. It's a lovely idea. Thank you, Rupert.